It may not be as sexy and exciting as a complete class rework or the changes to the feats, but there's only one section of the new 2024 Player's Handbook that delivers a bunch of new action options to turn your combat scenes and your exploration and roleplay from dull and samey into fun and unique. And it's my absolute favorite new section or changed section in the book, the equipment section. Speaking of the book, a big thank you to Twin Steel for loaning me his copy of the Player's Handbook in advance of the actual release. It's up on D&D Beyond now, so you guys can get access to it, but I am looking forward to getting my own physical copy and returning Twin Steel his. In the meantime, he did ask that I plug out some underrated creators, and there's a link at the very end of this video to a video that you might like. So Chapter 6 of the Player's Handbook, the equipment section, has a number of different sections that all cover different forms of equipment, and there's a lot of little neat quality of life changes that I really enjoyed. In the arms and armor section at the beginning, obviously, we have the weapon changes, and there's been a lot of discussion about the mastery properties that have been added to weapons. I'm not going to go over that in detail today. There's definitely videos out there for that specific niche, but some of the little changes that were really actually kind of big and useful was, for instance, having weapons art for every choice that you could make so that you had that visual again, which was like sort of side scrolled into without any labels on the old Player's Handbook. Having that art there is actually really impactful, especially for people who, aren't really sure what the difference between a halberd and a glaive is when they start out in Dungeons and Dragons, and it can be kind of confusing. The armor also has art now, which wasn't super specific in the old Player's Handbook, and now has art instead of using words to try and describe what it is. They're just leaning hard into the pictures a thousand words kind of thing, and I think that that's pretty neat, especially with full color art that sort of really details it out and gives you an idea of what you're getting yourself into. They also updated weapon traits just to tighten the language a little bit and made a handful of small feature changes in that actually really help in gameplay as well, like the minor changes to the throne property that allows you to draw the weapon as part of the attack so that you're not worrying about whether or not you do or do not have access to it, and the change to the heavy property that takes away the bias against small characters wielding heavy weapons, which did make a certain amount of sense anyway, but instead puts a requirement of a strength or dexterity of 13 in the appropriate score for the weapon that you're wielding, which actually impacts Gish characters that are finding ways to utilize their spellcasting stat instead of their physical stat to make attack rolls. So warlocks that are just, or somebody who's dipping warlock in order to get Pact of the Blade so that they can summon up their two-handed sword, still needs to have a modicum of strength in order to be able to wield it successfully. Though to be frank, the arms and armor changes have really been mostly about small quality of life improvements, whereas the changes to the tool section are kind of major. For instance, now every entry for the tools includes a specific short list in a specific format of information that tells us really useful stuff. For instance, it's listed as telling us what the ability is that a tool is going to typically use, meaning that we know whether or not it's a strength check, a wisdom check, a dexterity check, an intelligence check to utilize a specific set of tools, which wasn't really detailed previously. Tools felt sort of like a last minute add-on, and now they're getting a lot more focus. Because we have the specific utilize action now in order to use a tool or item in the environment, they tied that into their creation of the tools lists, and every set of artisan tools or adventuring tools now has suggestions on not only what kind of action could be taken using these tools, but also what the DC could be in order to succeed at that task. This is actually really impactful, and this is one place where we get a ton of useful advice and options for players to be able to suggest things, for DMs to be able to parse through when deciding on what kind of actions are possible and what could be done. For instance, just knowing that it takes a DC 10 wisdom check in order to paint a recognizable image of something that you've seen using painter's supplies. This is just a simple action option that we now have some kind of crunch about to know how difficult or simple this task should be rather than coming up with it for ourselves, and to know which kind of skill set and which tool set is going to apply best. It also gives a short list of the items that could be crafted utilizing that specific set of tools, which just helps to give people an idea from the later equipment list what kind of tool set they would need in order to make it for themselves. All of these kinds of things are things that we can pretty much figure out using our own common sense and the like, but that are really useful, especially to a newer DM, to have some examples up front so that they don't have to reinvent that wheel. They don't have to go through the fumbling steps of setting too high of a difficulty class for something that could be easy, or for maybe not being certain which set of skills or which ability score or which tools are going to be appropriate to what task. And then finally, tool proficiencies have their crunch of how they provide their proficiency bonus a little bit more defined. Now, if you have proficiency with a tool, add your proficiency bonus to any ability check you make that uses a tool. But if you have proficiency in a skill that's used with that check, you have advantage on the check too. For instance, the big impactful one that I spotted on this one is that you use thieves' tools in order to pick a lock or disarm a trap, but most of the recent adventures and some of the examples in the 2024 Player's Handbook have been using sleight of hand dexterity checks in order to do these tasks, meaning that if you are making that check with a set of tools, you're not only making a proficient check with sleight of hand, but you're also getting to give yourself advantage by using your thieves' tools proficiency. And I think that's a pretty solid way to tie them together so that if we can find a way to use our tools, then even if we're making a skill check that we're proficient in, they don't just cancel each other out to where we're like, well, I got proficiency two different ways on this check. Yeah, I guess I get proficiency. Instead, we're giving ourselves advantage on that check, which feels pretty cool. The other really awesome section of the equipment chapter is the adventuring gear section. In the 2014 Player's Handbook, for whatever reason, a lot of the entries that we have in the adventuring gear table had minimal or no descriptive element or explanation of how they could be used in the actual game world. Obviously, it still provided us with tons of fodder for utilizing these items as a DM if we had a little bit of experience and knew what we were trying to do with it, and players could come up with whatever they decided to do and we would find a way to adjudicate it. But now the adventuring gear entries give us insight into how to actually use these as an action in a scenario that we're likely to come across. And a couple of the items got some pretty significant buffs and opportunities that I know are making me excited about the idea of playing a thief rogue who can use an item as a utilize action as a bonus action during their turns. We did away with one of the table entries that was really a poor choice of design in the old Player's Handbook, and now every item has its own entry instead of trying to cobble all containers together into a little chart that was oft forgotten when it came to your volume and weight that could be carried in an object. So Backpack now has its own entry that tells you how much space of stuff you can store in it and how much that can weigh without ripping it, which is a definite improvement in terms of finding it in the book for the average person, I think. Now, in addition to those kinds of entries, we have things like the new entry, for instance, on a simple chain. In the 2014 Player's Handbook, a chain has 10 hit points. It can be burst with a successful DC 20 strength check. That is correct and straightforward. It tells us what we need to know about the chain if the chain was just laying around, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about how we could use a chain. Meanwhile, the new entry on chain in the 2024 version is, as a utilize action, you can wrap a chain around an unwilling creature within 5 feet of yourself that has the grappled, incapacitated, or restrained condition if you succeed on a DC 13 strength athletics check. If the creature's legs are bound, the creature has the restrained condition until it escapes. Escaping the chain requires the creature to make a successful DC 18 dexterity acrobatics check as an action. Bursting the chain requires a successful DC 20 strength athletics check as an action. Instead of telling us about the object, the new focus is on telling us what the object can do. In this case, a very potent option if you were building some abomination of a character that could grapple and then bonus action utilize an object. Thief, Rogue, Monk multiclass. I'm looking at you. Now you can grab a hold of somebody and then chain them up so that they can't easily escape, giving them the restrained condition as you drop them down to the ground or leave them hopping, getting beaten up with advantage until they can figure out how to get out of this chain that you've used against them. The new rework on adventuring gear is all focused about how an item can be used, either with its storage quantity or as an action in a combat or exploration scenario. Things like the Climber's Kit, giving you rules on how to set an anchor point and how far you could fall from that so that you can stop yourself from falling off massive cliffs, and things like costumes, giving you crunch as to how they help you to pass yourself off as somebody who you're not. This kind of focus on how an item is going to actually be used in play is a huge quality of life improvement that makes this chapter a treasure trove of ideas for players and DMs alike. Because it's in the chapter, I do have to mention the disappointment that was the crafting equipment section. It is kind of the letdown of the chapter, as it's basically a cobbling together of the rules that had already been presented in other books, and it's not anything special or intriguing in any particular way. And the biggest fail of that is related to the time that they suggested it takes to make things. To determine how many days, working 8 hours a day, it takes to make an item, divide its purchase cost in GP by 10, round a fraction up to a day. It gives examples, etc., but the big fail to me is that for incredibly cheap and quick items, having to round up to a minimum of a day feels pretty lame. I personally would probably round to the nearest hour, just so that you couldn't just do things instantaneously, but you didn't have to spend 8 hours in order to craft, say, a single candle. If you happen to have the knowledge in order to be able to set a time based on the real world, you're always better doing that than relying on the rules in this. But otherwise, the crafting equipment section will give you some basic information that you can use, but that's probably not going to show up a ton at the table, especially given the time constraints on modern adventures. Though I wasn't focused particularly strongly upon weapons in the equipment chapter, the GM Philosopher has a fun video about how you can make weapons a little more interesting that you should check out over here. Regardless, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. You're my favorite. Happy adventuring.